I'm going to introduce Lisa Ward. Now, I don't like doing that thing where you give like loads of information about a speaker because it feels a bit like a eulogy and it's a bit weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Lisa talk about herself. But I will say that a couple of years ago I attended a lunchtime seminar. It was one of those webinar things. And I just thought I'd signed up because, you know, it looked a wee bit interesting. And then usually I'd put them on the background when I'm doing my emails and stuff like that. And I was like, okay. I couldn't do any emails. I was glued to the screen and I messaged, and it was Lisa speaking about lived experience work, and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. And anybody who worked with me at the time, Jenny's nodding her head, I said, oh, you need to watch this, we're going to bring her up because this is dead interesting. And I thought it was such a fascinating session, and anything that can, you know, pull my attention away from a really riveting emails was definitely worth doing. So I'd like to introduce Lisa, who's going to talk a bit about lived experience and what it means to solve the Rubik's Cube.
There you go, look, I've nearly tripped myself coming up. Excellent start. I'm informed I have an hour. I haven't timed this, so it could be 5 minutes, it could be 55 minutes, it could be 55 years. I will do my best to stick to time, and I'm already now feeling the pressure of having to be with it. So let's see how we get on. What I am hoping to do over the next hour or so is talk to you about what it means to work within lived experience engagement, co-production, expert by experience engagement, authentic voice, you name it. We've got 801 buzzwords for it. They all essentially mean the same thing. So substitute in the language that you find most appropriate. And I also didn't realise that these slides like pop in all over the place. I thought they were just static, so apologies that you've got some sort of dancing going on behind me. So I am Lisa. I work as a freelance consultant, specifically looking at lived experience engagement, and I've put in, on, around because I don't even know how you kind of describe what a relationship is to something like that. I will tell you a little bit more about myself in a moment, but I want to dive straight into some stuff first. I want to give you some introductory bits that are really important, and I also want to explain the title of my keynote. I also apologise for all of the bits of paper going on here. We would literally be here for about 10 hours if I didn't have them. So to keep me on track, I will throw them on the floor. There will be confetti, it will be great. So in terms of the title of the talk, lived experience work feels a little bit like a puzzle, right? And most of you are hopefully aware of a Rubik's Cube. If you're not, why weren't you born in the 80s? It was brilliant. But you know, as you get one kind of piece done, the next bit goes. And then you get the next bit sorted, and all of a sudden you've messed up the first bit. And it becomes this real challenge to put all of the different pieces together. And so when Jen asked me to speak today, I was really trying to think about like, what is the metaphor that I need to convey here? The other Brucey bonus, and this was more for my pleasure than anything else, is that I'm obsessed with music. And so what I've done over the course of some of these slides, not all of them, is stuck in some songs that either mean something to me, relate to what's been put in. Music's probably the thing that helped me survive over the years, and so it felt important to kind of bring that element of me into the work as well. So, first puzzle, side one of our cube. I'm actually going to give you 3 case studies, and I've got permission from the individuals in these case studies to share what I'm about to show you and what I'm about to talk to you about. I have, however, deliberately kept them a little bit vague just to try and keep some confidentiality in, because, you know, you don't need absolutely everything about everybody. So I want you to think about an individual who is reasonably young in the grand scheme of things, right? 25-year-old. History of suicide attempts, has been sofa surfing, doesn't really have any local connection, is very isolated, has been using mental health services for a very long period of time, left home very early. You know, lots of kind of complex stuff going on, right? For all intents and purposes is kind of a serial user of mental health systems and somebody that needs a hell of a lot of support. Then I want you to think about our second person. So this individual is 28 and doing a lot of work as an expert by experience. So they're somebody that, like many of the Authentic Voice panel, has survived domestic violence and is really happy to talk about that and share it, what works with a really wide range of people. And you're seen, for all intents and purposes, by some of the people leading the work as actually one of the most capable people to be doing it. So somebody that can get on a plane, fly to Belfast, speak to a room full of people, etc. And then I want you to think about the third individual. So slightly older woman, actually somebody with a professional background. So working as a chief executive of a rape crisis centre, managed to transition a team of 2 up to a team of 30, holds a national position as a trustee, but for whatever reason is really struggling and grappling with, well, what does it mean to say I have lived experience? What does that kind of dynamic do to the work that I want to do? And so has started thinking about doing study and research. If you think about those 3 people, A, what do they have in common, but B, who would you want in your lived experience space? And I suggest every single one of you will sit here and go, oh, we'd have all of them, any single one of them. And I also guarantee that most of you wouldn't. And actually that first woman is most likely to be excused, marginalised, not supported to take part because she's considered very vulnerable. One further up might be seen as not having relevant experience because they now work in services, and how can you separate out that delivery from that lived experience perspective? But they're all the same person, right? They're not case studies, they're not women that I've spoken to. They're me at different stages of my journey and at different points in my life, and every single one of them had something very valuable and something very important to say. But often what came out actually was the opposite, and you get these stories and these messages. So I had professionals literally writing case notes that when my partner entered the room, my demeanour changed, and clearly that was a sign that I was traumatised and I was emotionally unstable, as opposed to the fact that I was experiencing coercive control, and my partner worked in mental health services, and I knew if I said the wrong thing I was going to be sectioned. I was never asked what I needed, never asked what I wanted, never asked, what that difficulty was, never given that space to think stuff through. Meanwhile, at 28, I was given this real opportunity, right? This potential to stand up there, to use my voice, to explore sharing and what that felt like. But nobody sat me down and had a conversation with me about, well, if you share this now, what does that mean for your 40-year-old self? And there is stuff I'll tell you now that I would never dream of sharing with a room full of strangers, because it wouldn't be right. That probably was right for me at the time. I hold no shame about the things I did, but I think, it speaks to that real puzzle and that real learning piece that we have to do when we're working with people to make sure that we've got fully informed choices. And then at 35, actually trapped by a system, trapped by, these thoughts and these questions about power dynamics, about wanting to make sure my team, who maybe didn't necessarily describe themselves as having lived experience, feeling like their voices weren't valid or their knowledge wasn't useful. I didn't want people to think I wasn't credible. And often I was asked from people like, how do you know what you know? You're very intelligent. And I thought, if I tell you how I actually know it, your perception of me is going to completely change overnight. And so it's this stuff that led to that piece of research, that piece of work that Jen was talking about, that's out there in the world. And it led me to all of these kind of questions about, well, what does sharing our narrative do? Once you've said something, once you've stepped into that arena and said, I have lived the experience, you can't unsay it, you can't take it back. So how do we support people with that? What are the ethics? How do we empower people to make sure that they are informed? And for me, actually, it was really important to grapple with this puzzle, not just for myself, much as it was, a very personal journey, but actually to grapple with it on behalf of survivors who may be struggling with the same thing. And it was important to me, actually, because I know I have this platform for a reason, and I shouldn't have this platform. I actually feel often very deeply uncomfortable about the fact that I am pulled up here as somebody to talk to you all, and part of that is because I'm white. Part of that is because I'm educated. Part of that is because I now come across as middle class, because I've got a plummy English accent and I can get away with it, because I know not to swear to ministers. It's not good enough. We need to be making sure actually that we are amplifying the voices of those who don't normally get the platform to pass that mic. I'm perceived as stable, I'm perceived as somebody who can hold their own and, deal with it all. I tick some of the minority boxes, so people get a little bit of credit for doing that. And I was really thinking about this recent case at the minute of Giselle over in France, who, an absolutely phenomenal woman. Please don't think I'm taking anything away from her. The fact that she stood there and said, this is not my shame, is crucial. But it also really strikes me, the Me Too movement, where we started saying, oh, it was the likes of Alyssa Milano. It wasn't. It was Tarana Burke. It was a black woman in the US who coined the phrase Me Too. And how so often, the minute women of a particular type of privilege stand up and speak, we get heard in a way others don't. And you see that manifest, the times in which people say things like, how do you know they're ready to do the work? Or people must have had 2 years break before they come back and engage. And we need to put these boundaries in place to make sure that it's not unsafe for people or it's not triggering. And yet Judith Herman was talking 30 odd years ago about the fact that this kind of work is part of people's journey. Actually, those women who make the best recovery or healing or the sense of their journey do so because they get involved in activism. And actually my research, highlighted the fact that this is our bread and butter. The domestic violence and the sexual violence world were born on women talking to other women about the things that we had lived through. And yet, for whatever reason, we've moved away from it. So I've given you just a few of the quotes that people gave to me through the research. And actually, it was both amazing and validating to read stuff that I had been thinking about, and also incredibly disheartening to see women in your own sector recognising what we had started to lose, recognising that we had moved away from that place of a we into an us and them, the professional, the client, the service user, the woman, whatever jargon or language we want to use. So, much as I don't like to be a pessimist and I don't want to preach, these are my recommendations for this first puzzle. We've got to start removing the gatekeeping. We've got to stop assuming that only certain people can take part. We've got to do the stuff that the group were talking about this morning in terms of supporting that development, making sure that people have got access to adequate training, making sure that we're trauma-informed in the actual sense of trauma-informed. What does it mean to create a safe space? What does it mean to empower people? We've got to have space to have those open conversations, to be open to feedback, to talk about what's working, what isn't, how does this boundary sit for you, how do we need to adjust or shape stuff. We've got to start thinking about how we reduce power, and we've really got to start asking about who is missing from the conversations around the table. So on to the next part of the puzzle, my favourite one. People contact me and they say, we'd really like your help, we really want to co-produce, but... And there's always a but. And so these were some of the ones I've heard over the years, and I'm sure there are more. So we can't afford to pay you, or we only have cash as an option. We don't have anyone in space to provide the right kind of support. Actually, we want to consult, but we're going to call it co-production because then we can pretend we're doing the right thing. We don't have the training in place, etc. And yet often these are the same people that will say, well, I won't launch a service unless I've got a paid staff member to deliver it. How do those two things tally, right? That system is the same. They're advocating for well-trained staff. They're advocating for the right support. There's a system, we've talked about it all day long. I've heard multiple people mention it. And co-production doesn't fit within that system at the moment because that system relies on degrees of power. And you can see it here in the research when people were saying, that thing where, services go, oh, well, when we think somebody's ready, we'll go and ask that particular person if they want to be involved. And what you end up with is those people that have been involved in a service and used it effectively as the voices of the people talking about the service. But what you're not hearing from is those early disengagers. And somebody else was talking about, if people want to waive their right to anonymity, all of a sudden they can't even mention that they've used a service. So the service has become so protectionist of itself that they've backtracked from actually hearing people's voices. And yet back when I was that 28-year-old, I was being paid £18 an hour to do this work, right? There are places that still don't pay that rate for people who do lived experience engagement. And if I hadn't been paid that money, I wouldn't be stood here today. It's my whole journey and my whole being of moving out of that place of really feeling like I was never gonna be a survivor to somebody who could advocate on behalf of others. And yet despite all of that, I've had 2 breakdowns, I still have anxiety, I still take medication for depression. I deliberately got the sleeper train up last night because I knew if I had to accommodate a train and a hotel room, I wouldn't get here. That is my everyday reality. I can stand here and look professional, I can walk the walk, but we've still got all of that stuff going on. And I think part of the other thing we have to do is have those disagreements about those power dynamics and really start to unpick them rather than just kind of letting them happen quietly in corners. So my views on the things I disengaged with are probably more valuable than the services I did engage with, right? And likewise, you wouldn't expect your teams to be any good without training. And for me, this is that like Penrose staircase, right? That you're walking up but you're going down, and actually you're just kind of going round and round and round. Because I think what we do is we end up with these traps that we play for ourselves of saying we don't have X or we don't have Y in place. And how much actually is it a defense mechanism in order to avoid doing stuff that's really difficult? So I want to give you an example of why I think lived experience voices are super, super important. And I realised on the train up that maybe I should have used a can of Iron Brew here, although I think it would have ruined it. So I want you to imagine, well, I mean, you don't have to imagine, you can see there's a bottle in front of you. It's yellow, it's clear, you can see some ingredients on it. So if you look at this bottle from this very particular perspective, you know whether or not you might have an allergic reaction to it. You can probably just make out there's 2 litres of it and some sort of warning label, but we don't have the full information on what's in that bottle or, you know, what it is we might be consuming. If we go round to the next piece of the bottle, you can get a bit of a sense of the fact that there's a money-back guarantee. There's green branding on there, might give away the supermarket it's come from, etc. But even then, we still don't have this full sense of what's inside the bottle. And then if we go to the last image, finally we get this sense of what's in there, so we can see it's a bottle of diet lemonade. But what we now don't know is what the ingredients are, so we don't know if we're allergic to anymore. And we now don't know where to complain or what the number is to phone if we've got a problem with it. And I like to think that that's a really, really simple model of why lived experience, practice-based experience and research-based experience have to go hand in hand. Because if you miss one of those 3 pieces of the puzzle, you're missing a whole piece of the picture. And I also think it's really important to give credit where credit is due. So this is not my model. I have permission to share it. A wonderful colleague of mine called Justin that I work with on another project was explaining this to me over dinner. And as a group, we started kind of moving pieces around and kind of building this framework together to make it fit. So really just wanted to acknowledge his work within that process. And this is where I think it fits in the bigger system, which is why I think when we say we don't have money or we don't have training or we don't have budgets, I question that. Because actually everything we do sits in that bigger system. Everything we do sits in our commissioning landscapes. Everything sits within those external forces of who's in government and what their agenda is and what way they want to shape it. You know, so we really need to think through how we make sure that we don't lose that lived experience of voice because of that. So, for the second piece of the Rubik's Cube, please pay people. I'm not saying £18 an hour, but make sure that people are getting some sort of benefit for their time and make it equitable. You know, there are people on benefits who won't be able to be paid, but they could access extra training that you could pay on their behalf. There are other ways and means in which you can give gap to people if they can't have cash in their back pocket. Plan ahead, offer a range of support, make sure that you've got that CPD in place, and make sure you've got that system for the disengagers so that you're going to people who are leaving services early and saying, could we contact you in a year's time? You know, at the point the referral comes in, we contact everybody routinely after a year of being referred into our service. Would you be happy to be contacted? Because then you might start to get some of those voices from the people you don't normally hear from. So the third bit, and this is probably quite unique to those of us that sit kind of in this linchpin role, right, of being between groups of individuals and the service providers or policymakers. But I spend a lot of my life actually feeling like I'm not good enough, like I'm just not doing it well enough. And it comes from both sides, right? So people will say things to be like, well, we invited them, but they didn't turn up. Well, yeah, that's because you invited mothers at 3 o'clock on a Monday afternoon whilst they were doing the school run. Or, you know, we felt attacked. We felt like what people were telling us was really hard to hear. You know, I'm sure there will be people in this space right now who feel a bit like, oh, this is prickly. You know, this is hard to hear and digest. But we also hear it from the lived experience people, you know. They don't want us to co-produce. So I had it the other week. They've asked us too many times. Okay, but last week you were telling me they hadn't asked you enough. So how can we have this conversation now about this tricky grey area and actually work out a process for involvement so that it works? Or people feel like they don't act on what's been said, you know, and that's that feedback loop that people were talking about earlier. Make sure that people get the responses that they need. And so somebody in the research said it like, you know, this language of co-production actually being a bit of a misnomer. because it's like two sides, right? If you co-produce something, you've still got like the co, rather than being in it together and thinking about, what we might have talked about in the early days. And I actually, in part, blame the ladder of co-production for this, not as a theory, not as a principle, not as a tool we use, but because we view it as a ladder. Because we see that co-production as the absolute pinnacle of what we should be doing. But actually there will be people who don't want to co-produce. They don't have time for it. They're very happy to answer your survey for 5 minutes. They want their voices heard, but they can't commit in the same way. I'm not saying we should coerce people by any stretch of the imagination. But we do need to think about how we sit stuff at different rungs of the ladder. And I'm hoping when I say co-production that people kind of understand what I mean, but then it suddenly dawned on me, maybe people don't. Like maybe that's like the first piece of this puzzle, right? So when we talk about co-production, we're talking about doing stuff in equal partnership. And I think lots of people confuse co-design and co-production. So true co-production in research and service delivery means those people that help shape and design that service are also involved in delivering it. Very much like this conference here today where you've got the individuals standing up and taking part. I've seen people squirreling around and putting signs up, like, and literally being integral to the whole process. And that's great, that's brilliant. We need more of it, but let's also not rule out those other levels. I'm not going to talk through them. They are in the slides, go back to them. But as I say, there is this concern for me about this process of a ladder that kind of suggests everybody needs to get to the top to it. Everybody does this work because they want it to be better. If it was perfect, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't need to be having these conversations. But as I say, not everybody wants to do things in this way, and you wouldn't use a hammer to drill a hole. I would. That's the kind of person I am. But most of us wouldn't. We'd make sure we've got the right tools for the right job. So building in that time for reflection, to think through how we want to do it, to think through, making sure that we're not just using expert by experience or lived experience as another buzzword, because that, I've seen in the 4 years I've been doing this job, it's there, it's being drip fed, and there's only a matter of time before it actually begins to lose value if we don't really hold on to what it means. The other bits that I was thinking about were, the times where people have said things to me that, we can only co-produce if we do it from the start. I disagree. Start where you are. It's never perfect. Everything started, nothing is new. Jump straight in. Let's see where we can get to as we engage in the middle of the system. And it's a theory. It's a theory until we find a better theory. We use it in the way that works for us. In terms of that feeling like it's never good enough, use the right tools. Accept imperfections and engage people in the ways that they really want to be engaged and that suit them based on their input. Name stuff, explain stuff, refresh that shared understanding. I was sat in a group the other day and it suddenly dawned on me I had 4 new members of the group and I was talking about this local strategy. None of them knew what it meant, and of course they didn't, because they'd come in and I stood there doing the thing we all do, using the jargon, using the acronyms, talking about this strategy as if everybody understood it, and I really had to think about taking that step back. So puzzle number 4 is that us-them dynamic revisited. And I'm sure many of you who work in services are, as I said, acutely aware that our violence against women and girls history, our narrative, that 50 years that people were talking about, were groups of women coming together. They weren't professionals on one side and people with lived experience on the other. They were women educating other women and doing the work together, and we were very much collectives. And there's been some brilliant things that have come from our professionalisation and the funding of our services. Please don't get me wrong. I think it's great that we've got principles of best practice. I think it's great that we've got government funding when we never had that before. But I also think it comes at a cost, because it means we have to start squeezing ourselves in different directions to meet different agendas. And actually, really sadly, what I felt like is it reached a point where women within the movement stopped talking about their own experiences. And I certainly felt that as somebody who worked for a rape crisis centre for 10 years, who kept turning up to national conference thinking, why are we reeling these groups of survivors up to talk to us about what it means to be a survivor, but never once naming those of us in the room? 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of sexual violence. Many women have experienced domestic violence, and yet we think everybody that's watching this hasn't? It was a misnomer, but it became the elephant in the room almost. And I think it draws us back to Kelly. So Liz, as has already been mentioned, talks a lot about this early work in terms of how women were encouraged to join organisations. They were encouraged to join actions. You know, this talking about service users or clients just wasn't a word we used. And violence isn't just a personal issue, it's a political issue. We know that. Every single one of us in this room knows that. That's why we talk about it in Parliament. That's why we write it in strategies. But it's at the heart of our struggle. And so we really have to think about how we reclaim some of that and how we make that personal political. And I really like this quote by Jackson that I came across as I was doing my research. It said, "When I respond to another's testimony with me too, I am both testifying and recognising her testimony, and my recognition as her as a victim is dependent on her recognition as me as a victim. Our mutual vulnerability empowers each other." Scrap the word victim if you hate it, right? But that me too, that talking to us, that knowing nod that other survivors give somebody else when they say something that resonates. You know, the fact that women sit so they can see the door that other people haven't quite picked up on, that becomes really important subtly. That's that stuff that really changes how we work together. So as I said, you know, it's that funding, it's that professionalisation of counselling, it's that departure from collective structures that, as I see, has shifted the power somewhere, and we need to think about how we shift it back together. Right? That isn't let's be a movement against the funders. Not at all. Let's work with them. Let's have these mutual conversations about how can we support you with limiting and reducing pots of money to get the best possible outcomes in a way that best benefits the people that we're working with. You know, and how do we include those that have got the really innovative, you know, voices because they've lived it in that conversation. So for me it's this, and I live by this quote. It's up above my desk and I read it most days, and it says, let's stop fixing women. There's nothing wrong with them. Let's fix the systems. And God, ain't that the truth? You know, don't we all want to be at a point where we don't need domestic violence services? You know, what we want is to end violence against women and girls. What we want is to end violence against children. Do we solve that by providing refuges? In part, maybe, but in majority, no, right? We have to think about that activism and that campaigning route. We have to think about the systems and structures. And so the other thing that I was thinking about was kind of how we view these Venn diagrams, right? And if you have the kind of overlapping, here are the professionals and some of them have lived experience, and then here are the people with lived experience and some of them are professionals. How do we start to shrink that gap? Because actually, all women have a lived experience of violence and abuse. They might not have experienced domestic violence, they might not have experienced sexual violence, but how many women have walked home with their car keys in their hand? How many women have made the fake call? How many women have not gone out because it's dark outside and we feel a little bit unsafe? That's our shared reality and our shared understanding, and if we can start there, we break down some of those divisions and some of that kind of difference between all of us. So I think we need more team building. I'd really like to see shared activism. I'd really love to see that step away from the medicalisation of our work. I can only guess how many women in here have been diagnosed with some sort of mental health condition as a result of the trauma they've experienced. And that's not to invalidate it, that's not to take away from the labels that enable us to access treatment. But also, women are not those labels. Women have been impacted by stuff that has been done to them by other people, and they don't need the labels. And the other thing is remembering that that journey, that healing, is not a linear process. Puzzle number 5, this is where the song got really cheesy, I think. No apologies for the cheese that will come up in a minute. But what you end up with, particularly when you've got 1 or 2 people who are employed to spearhead this work, is a bit of a foot in both camps. Sometimes I'm like, I'm a survivor today. I can speak to people that get it, and we can nod and we can smile and I can share stuff about myself that's really important. And the next minute I'm thinking, oh no, I have to be a professional in this space and I can't share too much stuff. And we end up feeling like we're this bit in the middle again, you know, of never quite knowing how to navigate the world. And I think that comes for all people when they've got lived experience and they start to step into new spaces and new places. You know, individuals that might come to a lived experience group and talk really openly, and then they go back to their workplace. And do they have the confidence to tweak their policies? Do they want to? Do they feel able to? How do we kind of embrace all of the bits of individuals and all of who they are and what they can bring to a space? You know, so that constant wrestling with that lack of kind of access to peer networks, that, you know, I feel really fortunate to be connected with other people that are doing this work these days. But, you know, something about those different survivor voices that exist across the country, and how brilliant would it be if the Authentic Voice panel got to speak to the people in my lived experience group in Oxford, and they got to speak to the people in the university in London, and we all got to share kind of some of that learning and knowledge together. And on that, I asked some of the people in one of my groups, if you wanted to ask me one thing, if I was doing this presentation, this was at the point where I didn't have a presentation, I'm not going to lie, I was like, I'll co-produce it, it'll be fine, somebody else can give me bits. I asked them what they'd want to hear, and both of the people that responded to me actually really came up with, how do you do this? Like, it was a really personal, how do you balance the personal connection with the work we're doing? How do you maintain your ability to focus on bad days when your mental health is struggling? And I realised it leads to this dichotomy of, if we're unwell, then we become proof that survivors are too vulnerable to do this work. So if I step into the struggle and I name that and I'm honest about it, if I cancel stuff at the last moment, which is really poor practice for the people I'm working with, or if I carry on even though I'm struggling and I get it wrong, I've confirmed we shouldn't be doing it. But if I don't say anything, I lack that shared connection. If I say too much, it's too about me. If I advocate too much in professional spaces, I'm over emotional, I'm triggered. So you can't win. And that is unfortunately the inevitable truth of this work until we start building that shared understanding of struggle, because actually everybody in this room struggles. Everybody experiences grief, everybody experiences loss and heartbreak, everybody experiences a day where they just think, I can't do this for whatever reason. The more we can normalise that across society, the easier it becomes for everybody. So whilst this started about me, actually, it suddenly dawned on me it was a much, much bigger thing. And what I will say is there are some brilliant toolkits out there, you know, a small snippet of some of the ones that exist, including the SafeLives one. You know, there's all sorts of booklets you can go onto if you think, oh, I really want to do this work and I really want to do it well. They're there. The problem is they don't help you wrestle with these difficult bits that I've come up with today, you know, these puzzles that I've created that I have kind of half answers to. We really need to build in that space to reflect. We really need to build in that shared support and supervision. We need to make sure we're building it from values-driven places. We need to make sure we've got that self and collective care. We need to make sure we've got the boundaries. Despite the fact I said earlier, you know, the boundaries need to be fluid, that doesn't mean we do this without anything in place. It just means we review and reassess them. When we think about that, building that into our structures, you know, that's often the other bit is, yeah, we've got money to do this work, we've got time to do this work, but it equates to half a day a week of somebody's full-time job and small pockets of money. And we don't build in that space of the thinking time before and after. You know, I've spent 2 weeks thinking about this presentation. I'll spend another 2 digesting it and making sense of it when I'm done. And it's that emotional labour that we really need to start supporting people with. And I'm not saying we do that financially, but we do that based on those systems of mutual understanding and mutual support. Spoiler alert. This is apparently how you solve a Rubik's Cube. I'm 40. Am I 40? I'm 40. I still can't solve a Rubik's Cube. And that was kind of the point of this whole talk, right? Is that there is a puzzle. It is in theory solvable. There is multiple ways in which we can solve a Rubik's Cube, actually, it turns out. I've given you one, but I found God knows how many websites from very intelligent people telling me if I turned it left 4 times, tucked it under my right armpit and danced, it would do its thing, you know. But it's messy, it's complicated, it's difficult, and it's really hard for all of us to be thinking about doing these bits simultaneously. So I also want people to know it's okay to get it wrong. I'd still much rather people tried and owned that and did it, you know, ethically and supportively. But let's get messy together, because that's the only way we're going to start to unpick pieces of the puzzle. So I wanted to finish on the final bit, because I feel like, you know, it's been a bit doom and gloom at times, you know. Here's all the challenges I've come up with of 15 years worth of reflection on a topic that I haven't solved. Why do it? Why get out of bed and make this my bread and butter if it's so gnarly and it's so complicated? And in part, it's these two quotes. Prophet said, despite the fact that survivors now have a more limited role in feminist theorising and activism in the anti-violence movement than it's in its earliest phases, women who have been beaten and abused have always been part of the struggle. And I want us to continue to being part of that struggle. And that means I have to stand up and I have to speak and I have to be a part of it. And it means sometimes I have to take the platform, even when I feel uncomfortable, and even when I say, maybe it shouldn't be me, in order to amplify that for other people. And it also brings me back to Herman's stuff, you know, in terms of the women who recover, and I could write you another 4-hour rant about the term recovery and what I think that does to people. But, you know, she really spoke about that process for people of being involved in giving back, in making meaning from personal tragedy or personal difficulty, you know, and we find that by joining with each other. We find that in those nods, in those moments, in those bits of shared support with each other. This is what I needed to hear when I was 13. This is what I hope those women in here who have stood up and named themselves as survivors, and those who haven't, take away. You know, your voice is valid, your voice is important, it needs to be heard. We need to hear your truth. We're only going to fix issues against violence against women and girls when we're able to speak it, when we're able to do it together. Keep doing it, keep fighting, even when it's hard, even when it feels difficult, keep going. And when you're really struggling, you can scan the QR code and you can have my horrible music collection to empower you to keep going. That should be it.